Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MSL Society webinar. My name is Samuel Dyer, and I'm the chairman of the board for the Medical Science Liaison Society. For those on the line that don't know, the MSL Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and in fact, the only organization dedicated to advancing the global MSL profession by helping MSLs and managers become more effective in their careers. Today, we're excited to discuss and interpret how KOLs revealed how they prefer to engage with MSLs during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, the MSL Society is really focused on helping MSLs become more effective in their careers. We accomplish this by offering numerous unique resources for MSLs, MSL managers, and even aspiring MSLs, including, as you can see on the screen, over 130 original MSL research reports on various topics impacting the MSL profession. All of these resources that you see here, as well as all of our resources, are free to members of the MSL Society. Another really important resource that we offer is the first and only board certification for MSLs and MSL leaders. In very simple terms, like any other certification, it allows experienced MSLs and managers to validate their skills and knowledge of the MSL profession based on criteria determined by a large number of independent MSL and medical affairs leaders from some of the top pharmaceutical companies. Anyone who is interested in learning more about the board certification, you can go to that URL there on the screen. I'm also very excited to share and announce that we've opened up the 2020 Msl the Year Awards. This year, there are 8 categories, including MSL Rookie of the Year, MSL of the Year, and MSL Manager Rookie of the Year, and MSL Manager of the Year, with each having a U.S. and outside the U.S. awards. This year, we also have 12 highly experienced MSL leaders that will be judging all submissions. The awards are completely free to enter and to win, and you do not need to be a member of the MSL Society to participate or win. We're actually going to send a link to everyone to learn more. This is a great way to highlight the accomplishments and the achievements and to celebrate the MSL profession. So I would encourage all of you to participate in that. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few quick technical details. As participants, you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. However, in your control panel, which you see there on the screen, you'll notice that you have a question panel. We encourage you to type your questions or comments into the question panel throughout our presentation today. We'll address questions at the end of each discussion, and we'll try to interject as much participation and questions from the audience as possible. Also, for anyone who might be experiencing difficulty hearing us, just make sure that the volume of your computer or headset is turned all the way up, and the same for anyone dialing in. I'd also encourage you to log into the webinar on a computer or device so you can see the slides presented throughout the webinar, because we're going to be going through all of the data today. So we've also been asked by several people if this will be recorded. Yes, we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on the MSL Society website exclusively for members of the Society very soon. We just need a few days to put together and to get it up on the website. I'd also like to thank H1 for sponsoring and partnering with us on this. For those who don't know, H1 is a global data platform for every healthcare professional and healthcare organization. It's one of the most widely used platforms for MSLs to identify and keep up to date with their KOLs. So to learn more about H1, you can go to their website there, their URL, or just Google H1 KOL. So that brings us to our discussion today. And to really set this up and to think about where we're at, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the engagements with KOLs and HCPs have turned virtual. And so the MSL Society set out and worked with H1 to conduct a survey to gain insights into how the current COVID-19 pandemic is impacting KOL and MSL engagements. So the survey received responses from 475 KOLs across 21 specialties based in the US. These results and the results of this whole survey and what they mean for MSLs is clearly important and demonstrated by the fact that we've had around 900 MSLs, MSL managers, directors, and VPs from 52 countries join the webinar today and register for the webinar today. So during the webinar today, we're going to discuss the results of each of these questions and the survey results and what they actually mean. We're going to try to interpret that. And we also want all of you listening to please add your comments and questions throughout the discussion as well. Bottom line is we're all in this together. And so joining me today to discuss the results, as you can see here on the screen, is Dr. Deborah Kranschnabel, who is the head of North American Medical Scientist and Medical Capability at Vive Healthcare, and Ariel Katz, who is the CEO of H1. So Deborah and Ariel, thank you very much for joining me here today.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Samuel. I think working in medical affairs is a phenomenal place to be, and the MSLs are our front line. So I'm really excited to be here to comment on this.
I share your excitement and passion for both of you, so thank you very much. So here's what we're going to do before we get into the discussions and the results of the questions. What I want to do is I want to set up and begin our webinar by talking about the survey methodology and kind of what we did. And so here you see on the screen, what we did was we worked with H1 to actually hire a separate KOL research firm, and they were hired to conduct a survey with KOLs across the US. And so what we did was we created an online survey. It was open from April 30th to June 5th, and we sent it out, or they sent it out rather, to KOLs across the US. The survey included 8 questions, which were all required, and only completed surveys were included in the data analysis, and respondents were only allowed to participate one time, and duplicate surveys from a single email address were not accepted. And so the result of that was that the results also were not weighed in. So the results of this is that what we also wanted was KOLs that actually regularly interact with medical science liaisons. Those are the only ones that were included in this. And so the results of this were that we got 475 KOLs representing 21 specialties. So this was that question. This was kind of the disclaimer here that, again, only those KOLs that actually regularly engage with MSLs were actually included in the survey. Just one last demographic data, because we got some questions on this. What was the breakdown of medical specialties? And you can see that here. There's a good mix of specialties across 21 areas of medicine. So that leads us to where we're at on the survey results. And so our first question that we asked these KOLs was, we wanted to find out what was their most preferred time to engage virtually. And we termed virtually, as you can see here, Skype, phone calls, however way they interpreted, with medical science liaisons during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to start with you, Deborah, on this. When you see this data, how do you interpret this? What is sort of your reaction to this?
Yeah, Samuel, when I looked at this, for one thing, it set off a lot of questions in my mind in terms of, okay, well, what were the specialties? Who was answering this? How impacted they were by COVID? And one of the reasons that's prevalent in my mind, it has to do with the company that I work for and the individuals that my team works with, who are primarily infectious disease physicians. as well as internal medicine doctors treating infectious disease. And if you think about it, they were a group that were significantly, everybody was impacted, everybody that works in medical care. These were individuals that were actually delivering care to people infected with COVID as well. So with all that being said, I had all those questions and the data isn't cut that way. So I kind of looked at it and compared it to what the trends we've noticed are. And this is not significantly different than what we've seen in ViiV with more people preferring afternoon appointments. And that's changed a little bit from the pre-COVID time where we had more of a split between afternoon and evening. But I will say in ViiV, we have seen more individuals than the 20% preferring the evening. It's been like 35, 25 from that perspective. And that is because a number of our providers who are incredibly overwhelmed during the day do have more availability in the evening as well. So one of my first thoughts was, yes, the trends are similar to what we're seeing in ViiV. I think the other thing that stood out for me from this data is while the majority said they preferred the afternoon, the 40% compared to each segment, the vast majority did not prefer the afternoon, right? You had 60% of people choosing some other time. And I think the bottom line for all of us is that, you know what, it's not a one size fits all in terms of when we're available to individuals who have needs. We have to be flexible. We have to have individuals and things in place that meet individuals where they are and what their needs are.
Yeah, excellent. I think it's great perspective, Deborah. Ariel, any thoughts on this and maybe some perspective from some of the companies you guys are engaging with?
Yeah, so I don't want to jump the gun to the next question, but what was fascinating to me is about 4% said that they're not interested in engaging with MSLs. And then right below it says about 4% they don't find value engaging with MSLs during the pandemic. That's really low in a good way. As Deborah said, infectious disease docs, internal medicine, the specialists that were here or that were surveyed, they really range across the board, but definitely not too many like primary care facilities. And so folks that would be at these medical centers, hospitals treating patients or forced to treat patients because there's no more elective surgeries in the hotspots. And so that's a really good signal from my perspective. It's something that I think is consistent across the survey too. There's the value. And as Deborah said, yeah, people want the afternoon. People are probably really busy before 8 a.m. Not so surprised. Not many people put that answer, but just the consistent value that MSLs are providing even during and through the pandemic. And this was asked in April, which it was still somewhat fresh and somewhat new in our society, in the US at least.
Yep. Yeah, I think these are great insights and observations from both of you. And you know, I certainly what I would add to this when I look at this, in of itself, it seems kind of boring and kind of dry data. Like, what do I do with this, right? Because it is kind of all over the place. And I think Deborah, as your point is, yes, the highest percentage was 40%, but the other ones combined is more than that. But I think for me, when I look at this, I say to myself, one very encouraging observation gained from this is that regardless of time, KOLs are still expecting and willing to engage with MSLs, right? And excuse me. And so you think about only 4% are not actually open to engaging with MSLs at this time. And so for me, when I look at that, I think it's very encouraging. And Ariel, to your point, we're in the height of where it's just fresh, this whole situation with the COVID, and KOL still saw the willingness or had the willingness to engage with MSLs. Deborah, any thoughts on that comment? Maybe we lost Deborah. Ariel, any thoughts on that?
Oh, no, it's true, and it's consistent in the numbers and consistent with what we're seeing. Obviously, we're all adjusting to like virtual engagements, but we work and have experience working with thousands of MSLs globally. And it's been different outside the US and in the US. I don't know for the attendees today how many are in the States versus outside. But definitely outside the States, it's getting back to normal, and in the States, it's becoming the new normal, virtual engagements.
Yep.
And so seeing that consistent as well. I am curious from Deborah's perspective if she's back. I mean, she was dealing with like the most impacted healthcare professional group, infectious disease.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about that. I was double muted just for full protection.
Okay, fair enough.
One interesting finding that we've had during this time, and I think it's a reminder that these are healthcare professionals, but they're also people. We've all been in their shoes too, and they're living through things just like we are. We've had several external experts and clinicians ask us, hey, is there any way you can meet with me on a Saturday or 10 o'clock after I put my kids to bed? And those requests, which were few and far between in the past, now make up, I would bet, 5 to 8% of the engagements my team is having. So I think it's also a call to continually be gathering that feedback and meeting people where they are.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, absolutely. So we are getting a lot of questions and comments. So I'm going to try to address some of these comments, and we'll get questions as well. And by the way, for anybody who has not been on one of our webinars or one of our live Insight show, how I do this is I'm going to read your question verbatim or your comment, and I'm going to use your first name. For whatever reason, if you don't want me to use your first name, just type it in the chat. But I do this just to make sure that you understand your question was asked. So here's one question is from Mark. Were the 4% that weren't engaging disqualified for the rest of the survey? No. So we asked them if they were willing to engage, and if they normally do engage. That was that first disqualifier question, but that's the only one. So they were included in the rest of the survey. Here's another question. Okay, so Barbara is saying, I was looking for one for you, Ariel and Deborah, but another comment. Barbara said things are changing so rapidly. It'd be good to have another survey that reflects 6 months post-pandemic. I agree. We do want to do some other surveys with KOL. So great suggestion, Barbara. So this is an interesting one. This is from Anne, and we can certainly have both of you comment on this. Anne says, while most KOLs are open to meeting with MSLs during the pandemic, are these specific topics on which they are most interested in? Is it research, adverse events, applications of products to COVID, new indications, et cetera? I think that's a really good discussion point. Deborah, what are you guys seeing with your team in terms of, what are the topics that they're most interested in?
Yeah. Vive Healthcare is a global company that's focused on HIV care and treatment. And the majority of our physicians and external experts, they really want to be kept abreast of the evolving data that's going to inform care. Now, the level of that data that's important depends on what the profile of that individual is. So if it's a global expert who's putting together conference updates, they're going on pipeline, they're going to want the most, they're going to want information that was recently presented on pipeline. If it's a clinician who's just seeing a ton of patients, they're going to want the most recent data on the marketed products from a clinical treatment perspective. Something that was really telling to us is when the stay-at-home orders happened in the U.S. for COVID, it coincided with the first day of one of the premier HIV conferences in the U.S. So at the 11th hour, there was this rapid switch of the conference to virtual engagement, and that marks one of the busiest times for my MSL teams in the field. And to be honest with you, I thought there'd be a lot more people in that bucket that says 4% that they're not open to engaging at this time. And I was really pleasantly surprised how much of a priority it was for our HIV and our clinicians to have the data that they needed. And the reality of it is, yes, COVID is a huge priority for them, but they're still managing all of these patients that are with HIV on a regular basis. We saw a delay. Like typically the reach out and the follow up from that conference happens within a shorter period of time. So for some, they had to, get their information down the road. But by and large, evolving data for us, Samuel, is some of the priority information that individuals want to hear.
Excellent.
Deborah, we've seen
Mario?
the same. Yeah, we've seen the exact same thing where continuing to have the same level of communication about the same information prior to COVID is what we've seen MSLs doing successfully, even after COVID. Not inundating communication around COVID, and it's all we read about today on the news, etc. But data readouts, information about the research going on in that given therapeutic area is what these KOLs are interested in discussing. If they have a new publication that came out in there that they've published, they want to talk more about that than COVID is my guess, unless they're treating COVID patients. And so continuing that same level of communication as it was pre-COVID, we've seen that same thing, which is surprising, but it's what we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so this is I think that the takeaway here is that as you guys have pointed out, that this is really about meeting them on their time, whatever their preference is, uncovering that, executing on that. But I think the bottom line is that KOLs are still willing to engage and want to engage. Let's move on to our next question, which was, we asked the question during the pandemic, how valuable have the engagements actually been with MSLs? Deborah, I'm going to start with you again on this one. When you saw this, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I have quite a few thoughts on this one. And so when I looked at this, I'm like, okay, if you want to look at this from a positive standpoint, only about 15% didn't see value in some way, shape, or form, which leaves the vast majority either neutral or better in terms of value. However, as a leader and somebody that's continually striving for excellence, I wouldn't be thrilled if these were the results that I got back on my team, because I want to see everybody in the very valuable bucket. With that being said, I think the first thing, context is key here, right? We had a global pandemic being resident throughout the US. And people, if you think about what these clinicians were trying to do, they were rapidly having to transition to telemedicine, to stand up what they had previously supplied in the clinic via telehealth, and then find a way to allow people who needed it back into the clinic. They were rapidly trying to accommodate staff members and policies and things to help with the concerns and people coming to work. There were so many things that they were dealing with. So I think that softens that a little bit for me, and the fact that with all of those competing priorities, that they still saw the MSL interactions to be, one, valuable enough to still have them during that crazy time, and two, even after they had them, they were valuable, that was relevant. Now, with that being said, there is something that just stepping back to let you know, in ViiV, we've grown very rapidly in the past 2.5 years. And one of the things that we've had to really focus on is how our MSLs show up in those interactions and why they're going in. And Ariel, you made a comment about value. And I think there are so many things that feed into what proves value for the external expert or KOL that MSL is seeing. But one, the MSL who's going in to see that individual has to know what that individual wants and needs to provide value, because that's going to ensure that when they're in there sitting in front of them, they're delivering something that that person has already confirmed that they want to see. And then two, how are they sharing that information? Are they aware that this is a crazy time, maybe that they have 20 minutes? Are they being succinct? Are they covering the data in a way that's resonating and hitting on the high points, asking the right questions? So I think it's a call to action for all of us, leaders, MSLs, to ensure that we are making that time count for us and that time count for our providers. And the last thing I want to say is there are continual challenges from our commercial stakeholders to increase medical engagement, frequency, what report out on the metrics. And it is always something I'm incredibly passionate about, that yes, we put our MSLs and ourselves in a position where we can really help advance education, insights, company information on strategies that from the external experts that we need to change, but we're not holding up metrics to our teams or reasons to go see physicians that aren't aligned with provider value, because that's like winning the battle and losing the war.
Deborah,
there, Samuel. Sorry.
Yeah, I love it. No, that's great. Love it. Love the passion.
Samuel and Deborah, what do you think the numbers would be? I don't know if we have any clue before the pandemic. Like, do you think it would be like we saw 21% very valuable? You think that'd be like 40% and the numbers would change? Or do you think this is like a standard deviation distribution that we would see for any team where 25% people love, 25% are neutral, 40% are medium neutral, 5% are bad, 10% are pretty bad? Or do you think that would significantly change?
It's a great question to you, Ariel, and probably one to better ask Samuel to see if this has been done before. I would need some more information. When I look at the people who responded in OBGYN, cardiovascular disease, and GI that made up like over 50%, I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about those teams. I think there are a lot of factors that determine value. I think overall, this slide sends out a very positive message given the context, the fact that this 80%, over 80% found some value in these interactions. But in terms of what this would have looked like prior, I'm not sure. I don't have enough insights.
What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I'll talk about kind of prior to this as well. But when I look at this, I'm with you, Deborah. So if you look at these numbers and you just look at sort of the value proposition, what it says to me is, again, and I agree with you, the context during the pandemic, when a lot of these clinical practices were furloughing their own staff, they're cut down on managing their own practice, and they had other business things going on as well as just patient care. So there's a lot of things happening. And yet with all of that, 61% of KOLs reported their engagements with MSLs to be somewhat or very valuable. And so when you think about the value proposition, the success of any MSL is dependent on their ability to add value to the KOLs that they support. Now, part of that is finding out what that is and then executing on it. And that's, sort of the art of being an MSL. But the fact that the majority of KOLs are gaining value from their interactions with MSLs, I think demonstrates this success. Now, prior to this, what we do know is the MSL Society conducted the first ever quantifiable number on the average time an MSL gets with a KOL versus a sales rep a couple of years ago. And that number was 45 minutes versus 2 minutes. And I'll offer that there is no KOL in the world practicing any type of medicine that is ever going to give up 45 minutes of their clinical time or otherwise office time to anyone who's not adding value. And so we do know that from the COVID survey from MSLs that average time has went down as a result. But if you mirror the MSL survey that we did during the COVID, the stuff prior to COVID, and now this, it's clear that MSLs are still being successful in adding value.
Samuel, if I could add a comment that perhaps could reassure some of the MSLs that could have had questions in their mind. During this COVID situation, a lot of the MSLs on the team were really uncertain if even reaching out for engagements during that time was the right thing to do, knowing what the infectious disease community was facing. And we were not pushing, right? MSLs make appointments to have interactions. They don't cold call. So we just held it out and moved forward. And remember, too, we had just had a sizable amount of data presented at the conference. And we heard almost across the board from the community that my team interacts with, their external experts, so many of them thanked the MSLs because they weren't able to attend the conference. Hearing conference data at these virtual conferences, they're not all running perfectly and smoothly. I think we're all familiar with that. And they were so appreciative that the MSLs were actually engaging them on the data and taking the time to do that. And they also were really starved for some collegial interaction and things that weren't just about COVID. So I think that was a real aha to a lot of the MSLs and just a confirmation that these things are valuable to our external experts.
Yeah, that's excellent.
I agree with that, Deborah. Like if there's an MSL on this call and thinking, I just listened to this virtual conference and there's a hotspot in Texas, I don't know which state it is now. Should I send the note to the KOL? I think we've seen through all the information that we're seeing in the survey and what Deborah's seeing and just dealing with infectious disease doctors are the ones who are treating COVID patients and what we're seeing with our MSLs, you should still send that email. You never know, and they might read it at night or on a Sunday. I think we're consistently seeing that there's value from KOLs in getting that note. So you should still send the note, and I wouldn't hesitate to do that from what we've seen.
Yeah, lead with empathy, right? Yeah, absolutely. We got a couple of comments. Nikki is asking, do we have geographic breakdown of the KOL responders? No, we don't actually. And what the KOL research firm did was simply, at least we didn't put it in the survey, we sent it out nationwide, and it was really about across the country on which KOLs actually wanted to respond. So it was based on that. We also got another question on what was the further breakdown and subspecialties of these areas. All of these KOLs self-identified. So they're the ones that actually put their specialty in those categories. That was not from us. Here's a question from Paul. Paul says, I wonder too if the type of information changed during COVID, not readily available information about our products and how to use in COVID patients. Wonder what the percentage value would be pre or post pandemic. I think we kind of addressed some of the pre, but Deborah or Ariel, any thoughts on that? Like, what the sort of the percent valuable would be post pandemic? Do we expect this to be higher?
What do you think, Deborah? Barbara asked this question earlier. I don't know Barbara's last name, but Samuel, I think we have to run another one of these now, especially globally. We did this in the US. I mean, countries like within Europe, China's getting back to normal. A lot of the countries are getting back to normal and seeing what this information looks like in the US today, as well as outside the US. If what we saw was true about the time of engagements, I would assume these numbers start to shift in a more positive direction. I'm assuming there's still 5% there's always that 5%, but turning that 40% lower and making the very valuable higher is my guess of what we'll see. I think it's a good idea to run it over the next couple of weeks and see what it comes out though.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
I would agree with that. I would say that we just had another conference in the US, and while the pandemic isn't over and there's still a lot going on, it's not quite as tight as it was, and there's some sense of almost routine coming with the way people are managing their clinics. And during that the survey period, and when the pandemic first hit, we saw about a 15% drop off in the number of EEs we could engage during that time, which was low. We thought it was much lower, or it was much lower than we anticipated. But the number of minutes that MSLs were spending were the same. So I would anticipate that, and we're already seeing numbers almost back to baseline prior to the pandemic following this conference. So I think availability is well, we've seen availability go up. And I think with that, the pressures and making the information a priority is only going to increase as well.
Yep, absolutely. Great perspective. Let's move on, but before we do, Diane has asked, could you provide a little more information on the selection of the KOLs to include in the survey, i.e. what were the criteria? The criteria was simply, it was a KOL research firm. They used their KOL database, and the only disqualifier was that it had to be somebody that had worked with with MSLs in the prior year. And so that was really the selection criteria for this survey. So we've kind of talked about how valuable it is. Let's move on to the next question, because now we're going to kind of think about, okay, how valuable is it, but how important is it for KOLs to maintain contact with MSLs during the pandemic? Deborah, again, I'm going to start with you. What was your reaction to this?
So I think this just confirmed that the value responses on the previous slide were really impacted by context from the pandemic, because the vast majority, except for maybe those 4% that weren't open to seeing MSLs, want to maintain contact. So that was my initial sense just from looking at this. I will say one of our experiences during this time is, even for those individuals that told our MSLs, you know what, I cannot fit this in right now. They said, please check back with me in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or can you send me information to review so that I could just come back with you for questions. So this reflects what we're hearing and seeing, and I do think it should make all the MSLs out there very reassured that they're bringing a lot of value to the medical community.
Yep, excellent.
Yeah.
Ariel?
I agree. So this relates to another question. I think staying in contact with MSLs can mean very different things. It could mean a Zoom, a phone call, an email, sending an email like a recap of the latest conference in case that KOL couldn't listen into it to learn about the latest like R&D developments. It seems like a lot of these KOLs want to stay informed and stay in contact over email to receive relevant updates and information. They might not have time to hop on a call, but sending that email is critical. What was Sam? It was like 85% preferred an email with information, some like incredibly large number. And so if you put this together with that, it's clear that they want to stay in contact, and the preference across all specialty areas looks like it's email. Stay in contact and get continuous updates about that company's or any updates.
And Samuel, the other thing, when I look at some of the folks that were responding, OBGYN, cardiovascular, they were some of the biggest buckets. Those were populations that were at particularly high risk from the pandemic. So, and we had so many people reaching out to us for their HIV community to better understand, for those patients that were in the hospital, questions about crushing and splitting and how do I dose titrate with the drug interaction. So that, I think that all lends itself to the need to remain close to their medical conduit.
Yeah, and yeah, these are great comments. And by the way, Ariel, I appreciate your excitement, but please don't jump ahead in the questions, revealing the email. But no, look, I think these are great comments. And when I look at this again, thinking about context, where we're at, some of these physicians were on the front line dealing with this pandemic, and yet the vast majority. So if you look at that, 79% of KOLs surveyed reported somewhat or very important to maintain contact with MSL. I mean, that is unbelievable. I think that is very, very positive if we think about the context. And so, as you look at this question, although KOLs were not asked why they value the exchange, I think it is reasonable to conclude that because KOLs consider it important to maintain contact, they are finding the engagements to be valuable overall. And I think that, to me, is certainly one of the interpretations of this data. I want to jump in here and maybe take some other comments from the audience. Brian is saying, my KOLs are discussing email fatigue. Is there another way that a newly field approved MSL can try to reach out and introduce themselves, because I'm not having much response? Deborah, any thoughts on that for Brian?
Yeah, so Brian, some of the things that work best for external experts are warm transfers, and those warm transfer, or what we call warm transfers, and those can happen through anyone that may already have a relationship with that external expert, and it may be an MSL who's worked in the area before that can make that introduction. It may be a medical director that works with in your company. It may be a member of the study team, but we've found that sort of partnership, if you're having some challenges getting your foot in the door, is extremely beneficial, because I think more and more time is precious, especially time during this, and they want to make sure their time is well spent. So an unknown individual is much more of a risk for them. So if you could partner with somebody that they know, they already have a collegial relationship, that's typically a great in. Ariel, you may have, I'm sure you have some comments to add.
No, that's exactly right. Handoffs, networking. I'm saying obvious things, but they could be helpful. If you've connected with someone that they've collaborated with, co-authored, spoke at conferences, asking for that warm introduction. So looking at like co-trialists, co-authors, co-presenters, engaging with them over social media is a new form that you could engage with. LinkedIn, Twitter, if you can see if they're like active and are a digital opinion leader as well. Those are just like creative ways in order to get in contact with folks. The warm introduction is ideal, as Deborah mentioned, but those are additional ways to do so.
Yeah, excellent points. Absolutely, find ways to get an introduction and again uncover what that value is and start executing on it.
Just one more comment to add, Samuel. I don't want to start, but something that we've added to our training modules, our onboarding training modules for all new MSLs, is a review of how to create engaging emails. Because sometimes even to get that appointment from a warm transfer, you need to do that. And there's really relevant data that links to catching somebody's attention and having them open an email. And it has to do with time of day. People are much more likely to open an email that they receive first thing in the morning, the subject line. So there's data and tools that can help even when you do have to send emails to make those more likely to be open.
Excellent. We got 4 questions here. I know we're getting close on time, but want to make sure we at least address all the questions. Ariel, I'm going to start with you on this one. So this was really about frequency. And so we asked in general, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, how frequently do KOLs prefer to prefer to communicate with an MSL? As you saw this, what was your thoughts on this? What's kind of some pearls?
This was a lot better results than I thought it would be. This is pretty frequent. About 30%, 1 out of every 3 KOLs here want to speak to an MSL at least once every 2 weeks. And so the vast majority of these, daily isn't super surprising, but the vast majority of these people do want to engage with MSLs. It relates to the whole theme that we've been talking about throughout this discussion of they do want to be contacted, and they do want to stay informed and stay engaged in different mediums now than before. But this was very surprisingly optimistic. I am curious how this will change now if we run the survey or before COVID, but these stats look really impressive and look good from my perspective. I'm curious what Deborah thinks and how this is positive or negative in your eyes for what you would expect from your team.
Yeah, great insights, Ariel. I was shocking actually. I couldn't imagine once a week, twice per week, even daily. That was mind-boggling. And then I thought, well, maybe if somebody is one of the companies is working on remdesivir, there's new data in OBGYN, and they're reaching out with specific questions. Maybe that drove some of this. I will say the frequency that my teams engage is not even on here. So by and large, they're engaging quarterly. But the fact that this is the engagement numbers, that bodes well. The one thing that the other piece of data that I put this with that would give me pause if I was reviewing this and these were the specific results for my organization is if you look at the somewhat valuable or those individuals who said not very valuable, and then I would love to see that data overlapped with this because I am much more about don't drive frequency, drive value. And so if you have new information to share and it comes up once a week, awesome. But if it doesn't, make sure that you're pacing yourself from that perspective. So
yeah, I think this is, and again, I mean, I was a little surprised this as well. And because if you look at, at these numbers, an overwhelming majority of 73% of respondents of these KOLs prefer engagements to continue to occur at least once a month. So if you think about, again, it's this fact that they are wanting continual engagement suggests that KOLs are placing importance on the relationship of MSLs, and I think that can be, very encouraging and something to be built on. Let's move on to this next question, and this was interesting as well. We asked, how receptive are KOLs to engaging virtually with MSLs? Deborah, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I was looking at this and I'm like, you know what? Most of them or all of them really had no choice to engage virtually. It forced it. And we've heard from many that this pandemic has actually expedited a virtual revolution that was in some ways long overdue. There have been many that have been trying to stand up telehealth. They would have preferred this happen a very different way, but it's kind of forced their hand to come that way. And we had no choice but to move completely in this direction. So they didn't either. And I will say the fact that we weren't the only ones holding up these virtual engagements. It was being done at medical congresses, their grand rounds, they were doing it with their clinic. That's driven a lot of receptivity. For those individuals that are not very receptive or not at all receptive, I mean, I think a lot of that can be linked in with the challenges with platforms and how engaging it is. I think all of us are getting better with that over time. We certainly have, but by and large, most of the individuals we're interacting with are in that very receptive, somewhat receptive. And I'll leave you with one final comment on this. We even have some areas that have now reopened to face-to-face interactions, but they're still being socially distanced. So my MSLs in many cases are still being asked to get to open virtual platforms. So while they're sitting 6 feet away, they can be talking but sharing slides and things on the virtual platform. So I found that very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. That sets us up for the next one too. Ariel, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the one thought is like future looking. I don't think this is going anywhere. I think fast forward 6 months, 9 months, hopefully one of the folks on the call, the companies will produce a vaccine soon. I don't think this behavior is going to change though. And so we should be thinking about how do we continue to support virtual engagements in the future, in 1 year, 2 years. There will obviously be face-to-face at conferences and there will be face-to-face, but I think it's going to be more and more virtual as the new normal, new accepted moving forward. And so adapting to this new normal and building up to support it and the future look.
Exactly. And I think you both talked about it. I mean, and the fact that 77% of all surveyed KOLs here were either somewhat or very receptive. And this was, again, just when kind of this thing was really getting started in April. And so what will it be today? I mean, I think it's out of necessity. And I think as telemedicine and some of these other things develop, I think that certainly, this is going to become a necessity. I think it sets it up for this one right here. What do you say about this? I think it's what we alluded to. Deborah, any thoughts on this?
Just to add to what you and Area Help already commented, I think there's going to be a blending of this moving forward. There's a component of the professional collegial relationship that people miss with the face-to-face. So I don't think we'll ever have a team that never engages face-to-face. I do think there's that community component and that need to be face-to-face that people miss, and they enjoy, that they'll look to stand up again. However, it's hard to give up the efficiencies, nor should we give up the inefficiencies. We've had providers and even MSLs say, oh my gosh, I was able to engage 3 people today versus, traveling for 2 days and seeing 1. And providers, that one of them said, I didn't even have to clean up my office. I was just able to jump on. I had it. They sent me the information. So there is a lot of positive ways of working that this is driving, but I don't ever think we'll have a team that's only going to be engaging virtually.
Yeah. But I think the bottom line, it's here to stay, right? I mean, and here KOL, some form of it, and I agree with you, the hybrid. Ariel, any thoughts on this? I mean, we kind of already talked about it, but
I think we're all aligned, and it's making everyone aware that this is here to stay. There's going to be some virtual blend, but it's definitely here to stay.
Yeah, and I think that, if you think about not only, as we've seen previously, physicians are clearly open and receptive. They expect it to continue, and so again, I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops. Our last question, which I found very interesting, we asked KOLs what their most preferred method of communication was. And we see it loud and clear here. Deborah, any thoughts or comments when you see this or when you initially saw this?
So when I looked at this and saw 82% email, I'm like, that's just impossible. That's certainly not what we see at V. But then I read through all of them, and these add up to way more than 100%. So it looks to me like individuals were able to check as many things they connect with. So when I looked at it like that, the fact that you have almost 100%, or well, I don't know if these are individual responses or not, but I'd like to see the data broken down per person. But with that being said, almost everybody who asks for concrete, finite data wants it to be followed up with something that's enduring. So the 82% didn't make that, wasn't hard to believe when I looked at that. I have to believe that the majority are preferring some other method in addition to the email, and that's certainly what we see at ViiV.
Mm-hmm. Ariel?
That's fascinating. I was going to ask Deborah, so have you seen most of them over like Zoom or WebEx or something, or have you seen phone calls?
Yeah, it evolves, and it's very dependent on the provider. So we started out with the Zoom platform, but then I think many of you may know the whole security thing came up for us as a company, and now we're using Microsoft Teams. We used Skype for a little bit, but we had a organizational evolution in terms of what works best. So most of the times MSLs use Teams, but we have plenty of MSLs that use FaceTime or get on their cell phone. It just depends on the provider's comfort level. But the virtual platform primarily is Microsoft Teams.
Got it. Yeah, so we've seen similar things in terms of virtual engagements where we've seen MSLs do as much as they can to try and get virtual FaceTime over Teams, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever the technology is. And similar to Deborah, I don't think KOLs want to only communicate over email, but if you're sending a conference poster or summary of a conference, some new data readout, a news press release, that's going over email. And so that's what helps explain the data. So this makes sense to me in that respect.
Yeah, and I think I agree with both of you, and I think the one thing that you could take away from this is that MSL teams have had to pivot immediately to this whole virtual engagement. And there's been such a focus on virtual engagement, getting on Zoom and doing all these things. And of course, the result has been Zoom fatigue and all these other compounding issues. I think when I saw this, what stands out to me is that don't focus solely exclusively on this whole virtual, that sometimes just pick up the phone or email me. It doesn't have to always be a virtual engagement. We want virtual engagements, and of course we all want to go back to some level of normal where we get face-to-face engagement interaction, because that's where the richness of that relationship is built. But I think what this says to me is that traditional communication channels still work, email and telephone, and don't be afraid to use that. And by doing so, it certainly will minimize some of the compounding issues. So that is the data. So I want to thank Deborah and Ariel. Thank you very much for your perspective and input on this. So thank you very much for being a part of this.
Oh, it was fun. My pleasure.
Yeah, same here. A lot of fun.
So just a couple more things to share with the audience. I just want to remind you guys, next live MSL Insight show is this Friday. We're actually going to be talking about emotional intelligence. Doug Yao, who is actually certified in emotional intelligence, it's really one of his specialties. We're going to be talking about the importance of emotional intelligence and KOL MSL engagements. So we will definitely send out a reminder for that and a link to the show at the end of this webinar. And so with that, I just want to again thank H1 for sponsoring this webinar and sponsoring and supporting the survey. I hope that everybody found this to be very valuable. I know all of you put in some great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Just as a reminder, the data here is free to the entire global MSL community. You can go on the MSL Society website, download the actual report and the infographic. It's available there. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up today's webinar. I want to again thank Ariel and Deborah for being here. We have a brief survey we'd like everyone to participate in as soon as the webinar ends. But with that, thank you very much for being here, and reach out to us if we can ever help with anything. So thanks again for everyone.